Welcome to another installment of Where Was God? This installment is called God and the Election. I don't think there's a single conservative Christian or a single patriot that hasn't asked the question, where was God in the election? The 2020 election. It just seems natural to ask, how could God allow the Democrats to fix the election? And after we've seen what they've been doing since 2021, we got to be asking, how come God allowed this? Well, it might be rather difficult to see God's hand in the 2020 elections. Most of us feel like God abandoned us. Some might ask why God abandoned us and write it off as a sinful world and God's wrath is just around the corner. That doesn't fit the narrative of the stories we find in Scripture. There's always time to repent, and that includes a series of miracles to convince people God is there, and all we need to do is acknowledge Him. It's a simple process open to everyone, so maybe that fixed election had to take place at this time to begin a final window of time for people to repent and turn to God. We consider the judgment process Paul wrote about that we covered in some earlier videos. We know that we're supposed to follow those instructions, and those instructions clearly pointed out that we're supposed to investigate matters. And when we investigate matters, we can clearly see how that fixed election exposed some of the things that were happening in the shadows that God suddenly shed a light upon. Not too many people were paying attention to those globalists and their plans for this world. We considered them as just some kind of nuts that would never get any place. And since the election, what do we see? We clearly see the U.S. spent trillions of dollars to support their unusual plans, and we're all aware of the players as well as their plans. We would have never seen that or taken it seriously if it wasn't for the fact that the fixed election took part. If the fixed election wasn't successful, we would have never seen the environment that we're sending our children to in the school system. We can compare that to a swimming hole polluted with a colorless, scentless, deadly chemical that will slowly kill everyone who comes in contact with it. As a matter of fact, it kind of sounds like the vaccine, but let's not get off track. If it wasn't for the fixed election, we wouldn't know about the corrupt school boards and how many teachers have wormed their way into the system. Believe me, I've seen this happening 30 years ago, so it's nothing new, but I thought it was an isolated incident. After the election, communists, Nazis, thieves, sex traffickers, and all kinds of perverts came out of the closet, out of the woodwork, as if they ruled the world and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Of course, they had to convince the new administration would support a corrupt judicial system that would allow them to operate in the open while suppressing anyone who opposed them. It is interesting to note that attitude, since it sums up the official Satanist creed, which by some chance mirrors the Marxist creed and all the creeds that all the communists cover. They all follow the same creed. If people don't agree with them, it's their job to eliminate the competition. And we've seen that in just about every communist takeover in the world. Now, if we go back about a year before the fixed election, we saw the political attacks when Nancy Pelosi launched 2 impeachment hearings against President Trump. That exposed the one-sided judgment process the Democrats felt they needed to be successful. Not only did Pelosi have to expose that system once, but just to make sure it worked, And to make a point, she launched another one-sided version of what she called a trial. During that trial, the world was exposed to secret witnesses. The accused was not allowed to face their accusers nor defend themselves. At any real trial, most of the evidence would have been thrown out based on the fact it was circumstantial. Witnesses did not agree, and none of the evidence could be proved. That didn't make any difference to Nancy, who determined the outcome long before the trial began. As one of the key judges in those cases, Pelosi made it clear she was far from unbiased. I mean, she made so many speeches to make the point that no matter what, she was going to have that trial turn out the way she wanted it to. She made her determination long before the trials and made it clear her verdict would be reached at all costs. It was a glimpse of the type of court system she envisioned for her new version of a democracy. None of that would have been clear if the fixed elections weren't successful. As soon as it was, everything and more than we could imagine was exposed. Now, we need to put together a few facts and begin the evaluation process and patiently wait to see how far God is allowing them to go before He says enough is enough. If the fixed elections didn't take place, we would never have seen Congress spend $22 trillion in 2 years. We all have that feeling and unproven knowledge that politicians spend millions to get elected to office because they have plans of making much more money than they spent on the election. Then we have the feeling, and if we look, more than enough evidence in the bills they passed that their major campaign donors are more than compensated. Take a look at those bills. You'll see in the Build Back Better bill and the inflation bill and every bill that they've passed, they name all the corporations and they're giving those corporations billions. Why do you think Target is not afraid to lose $10 billion? Why do you think Budweiser is not afraid to lose $9 billion? Why do you think all these other companies are not afraid to lose billions of dollars? Because they've gotten at least $50 billion in the COVID relief, the Build Back Better bill, and the inflation bill. Take a look at those bills. They're all named in there. All the evidence is in those bills, and I don't know why the so-called Republicans we have in office are not putting two and two together. It's more than obvious. It's all in writing. So these major campaign donors donate a few million, and they get a few billion in government grants. We know what's happened. We see it in the bills passed in Congress. If we read those bills, we're getting the evidence required to convict them in a court of law. That fixed election was a wake-up call to action, to begin gathering that evidence to bring those people to justice. Both the businesses, the business owners, and the politicians who have been taking advantage of taxpayers for years. Now, we kind of know it as the WEF, World Economic Forum, led by George Soros and Klaus, what's his name? Well, since that fixed election, we've got an open border like never before. Millions of people flowing in over the border, each of them paying a ransom to the cartel for passage into the United States. No one knows how many of those immigrants were enslaved to work in factories, to work on corporate farms or in brothels. We know, and if we did enough comparison, that those people coming in, those immigrants, are being forced to work in companies owned by WEF members. We suspected such things, but had no evidence to gather. But when that evidence is gathered and we put it all together, you know what? We never hear about half of what's going on in the news. In short, we're left on our own. But we're not alone. We have the option to organize, to fund, and launch our own investigation, but who's doing anything about it? Remember Watergate? Watergate was blown wide open by 2 reporters working on their own. We have the ability to fund and work with patriots willing to put their lives on the line to blow those plans they're doing right now out of the water. Well, drugs are coming in over the border, killing millions. Sure, we say that law enforcement is going to take care of it, but what do we really do to support law enforcement? And we've seen evidence of arms crossing the border. Those career criminals are not supposed to own firearms, but they're getting their weapons from someplace. Has anyone looked at the weapons seized by law enforcement and put the number of firearms that were never registered or manufactured in the U.S.? California just passed a number of laws allowing citizens to sue gun manufacturers when their products are used in a crime. Well, what happens if those weapons were smuggled in over the border illegally? You know, who's looking into that? But what we really need is a law that allows victims and their families to sue DAs and judges who release career criminals with little or no bail. You know, the criminals that are always back out in the streets within hours. And what do? Almost every single time they're out on a new crime spree. It's as if someone's ordering them to or someone's paying them to do it. There is almost an endless list of details that come into full view as soon as that fixed election was proved successful. Remember all the Democrats that even before the election results were in, came in there and said they got to round up all the Christians, send them away, and everything else. I mean, they said they wanted to eradicate conservative Christians. They wanted to eradicate Trump and all his followers. I mean, these people went on public record saying that. Well, in His mercy, God allowed that fixed election to take place because that was the only way to expose all those criminals and all the crimes, and we need to do something about it. It seems like we're stuck between a rock and a hard spot. We have the globalists to contend with, a collection of some of the world's richest leaders who control a large portion of the economy. Enough to cause record inflation, control the media, and even the world's food supply. We never would have known who was behind all this if it didn't come out in public to announce their plans after the election. For years, they have been working safely behind the scenes, building their vision of a world empire, and for the most part, we've been ignoring them because their plans seemed so ridiculous. They seemed of little importance because their idea was so far-fetched. It didn't even seem worth our time to pay any attention to them. And suddenly, after the election, prices soared, especially oil and gas prices. Censorship went into full swing. As soon as people looked into the issues, it became more than evident the people who owned and ran all those companies were members of an organization with plans to take control of the world. And what do we see today? We see this stuff for children being introduced to store after store after store. We see the Budweiser incident. We see all these things happening. They believe their wealth gave them the right to take over the world and, of course, make this world a better place to live. The question is, a better place for whom? So far, the majority of us have been asked to be patient through the growing pains. But what are those plans? Remember all the speeches they made in 2021? Pelosi, Biden, Harris. Oh, we got to be patient. There's going to be growing pains. Yeah, right. Growing for who? For one, they claim the world will end in a few years without their help. They claim we have to stop driving gas-fueled cars and buy electric cars. That's really great advice coming from people with more money than we'll ever see in our lifetimes. And by the way, wasn't Paul Pelosi arrested while driving a gas-powered Porsche? They say one thing and do another. So we can see how much concern they actually have for the environment. And the people who are telling us to buy and drive electric cars, the most expensive electric cars, but those people, what do? They own planes, they own yachts, they own all kinds of stuff, and you got to consider the source. Take into account many members of the elite organization trying to take over the world also own a whole bunch of factories. Have they done anything to ensure those factories are following the Green Plan they're forcing on the rest of the world? Or are they exempt from those rules? Oh, of course, now they're starting to use slave labor. Anyway, one thing that just kind of came to mind, back in the 30s, they had what was called the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl. Actually, the Great Depression was somewhat caused by the Dust Bowl. World temperatures went up, crops dried up, died, lack of rain, all of that stuff. Well, back then, if you watch the old movies, half the people were still using horses. And, there weren't a whole lot of cars, and the population was a lot less. So how did the Dust Bowl happen back then, and what caused it if they didn't have all those cars and all the factories? Well, I've been looking back at Europe for over 10 years, and I've been seeing factions in Europe trying to legalize every sex crime. I mean, they want to legalize sex crimes most of us don't even want to think about. Well, that news in Europe tells about dozens of high-ranking officials involved in one sex scandal after another, and also involved in sex trafficking, and of course, a lot of those European leaders were pedophiles. Well, now we see this happening in the U.S. since 2021. Since the fixed election, those people have come out of the closets. And they've been passing a number of laws to support and fund the organizations that are trying to legalize every sex crime and act. And we can see there's absolutely nothing being done about all of the immigrants being brought in over the border and sold off into you don't know what kind of sex industries. Well, we could write a really long list of all the things and people that have crawled out of the closet since the election. Now, they're fully exposed, but they all expect special treatment by the current administration. We wouldn't have seen any of this if the fixed election didn't go through. Now we can see all of it. When we look at the choices Biden made when he appointed people to key cabinet positions, we can see the last thing on his mind was to surround himself with experts in any field able to introduce ideas and concepts to actually grow the country to the next level. Instead, we have seen everything ripped apart and broken down with absolutely no plans to rebuild. Matter of fact, Biden brags about having the most diversified cabinet in the history of the U.S. with over 37 types of genders, well over 100 different pronouns. But you know what? They all share the same common insanity. Well, I got to bring this up because we all have to accept a portion of the blame. Before the 2020 election, we were living a good life. Jobs were up, wages were up, the cost of living was moderate, gas prices were at, I'm not going to say all-time low prices for us, because I remember 25 cents a gallon gas, but they were low. Home sales and auto sales were up, along with every single luxury item. History has shown when things are good, we tend to forget about God. If we're honest, we can admit that happened in our own lives. We forget God. That leaves our children open to attack from the devil. Let's go back to the original question. Why did God allow this? We gotta kind of ask the question of, is it okay to question God? Well, I'm going to leave that up to you. You go through the Bible yourself. You decide whether or not it's okay to question God. But with everything that's been happening in the last 2 years, how many of you parents have sat down and had a talk with your kid to explain the situation? Or, better yet, how many of your children have come up and asked questions about how come this is happening, how come that's happening? As a parent, what do? You explain it. Okay, so God is supposed to be the father of all of us. Is it okay for us to ask God why this happened? And shouldn't we expect an answer? Well, we got to admit, we've seen it happening for the last couple of years. The devil's plans are to target our children. That's been exposed. We're waiting for the government to do something about it, but nothing's being done. Well, after the election, we did a quick about face from the life of comfort to being on guard to facing an all-out spiritual battle. We never would have seen that battle if the fixed election was not successful. We know that dark side existed, but as long as things were going well, we more or less ignored the obvious, believing the government had a handle on it. Well, it turned out Satan just needed a little crack in the doorway to rush in and take over. We have to admit, we never expected to see things change so quickly. To think we have been living the past year, and actually 2 years or more, with one person standing in the gap to stop a portion of the most dangerous bills ever introduced to Congress from being law and changing the landscape of America forever. When we look at what's happening in Congress right now, we look at the numbers, we know that we have such a tiny minority that's actually stopping everything that the left wants to do from becoming a reality. We can see what's happening. We can put a list together and see all those events fitting together, and in many cases, see what is coming, what's on the horizon, what's the next plan. I mean, come on, most of us can see what's going to happen before it even hits the news. But we're not going to see an end to it until we start reviewing the evidence, like all those bills being passed, where the money's going, and connect those benefiting from those bills and what those companies have done since receiving those funds. One example is Amazon, who showed record profits during the COVID-19 shutdown. Well, after receiving record profits, Congress in 2021 gave them billions of dollars in COVID relief funds, billions more in the Build Back Better bill. And what did Amazon do? They raised their subscription fees 50%. Yeah, the same thing with internet coverage. Companies that provide internet coverage, Wi-Fi. Government gave them billions of dollars to expand Wi-Fi. We all heard about it. So those companies received billions of dollars. What they do the next day? They doubled their subscription fees. So there's dozens, actually hundreds of connections in those bills that we have to make. Well, we can't depend on Congress making those connections and filing charges for crimes against the American public. We've all seen there's only a handful of true patriots in the government right now that are willing to stand up. As a matter of fact, you look at how many thousands of people are in the FBI and how many whistleblowers came forward, 4 of them, to expose what's happening. FBI is watching conservative Christians instead of terrorists. They're investigating parents in school board meetings rather than investigating and trying to figure out why we had 6 mass shootings in schools. And the connecting factor was they were all on drugs to change their sexes. I mean, come on. Stuff isn't happening. So what are we going to do? Well, we got to pray about it. We're waiting on one of 2 things to happen. Either the judicial system gets involved and straightens things out, or God gives us specific orders on how we're supposed to handle these things on our own. Anyway, right now, I'd have to say my money's on God. Okay, don't forget to like, don't forget to share, and do all the other stuff that you see on all the other video channels. So, without any further ado, keep on praying, and hopefully we'll see better days ahead.